This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we want to shine a spotlight on a niche new law adopted unanimously by state lawmakers in 2025 at the behest of the State Department of Financial Services, which addresses unlicensed activity in the financial sector. And our guest is Winston Berkman-Breen, Legal Director for Protect Borrowers, who in a previous life worked at the State Department of Financial Services, known as DFS. Thanks for making the time, Winston.
Thanks for having me.
Well, based on the bill memorandum, this law is supposed to address an existing dynamic that, at least in some cases under the financial services and banking law, state financial regulators haven't been able to impose monetary penalties on people or organizations who chose not to get licensed or ignored similar authorization requirements from the state. Do you have a sense of how this loophole in the regulatory structure may have manifested itself over time?
Yeah, sure. And honestly, it really could be anything. And I think listeners might take for granted how some of this works. But in general, if you want to be a check casher or a money transmitter like Western Union or a mortgage loan servicer or a student loan servicer, or if you just want to be a lender, you generally have to go and get a license to do that by the state. The legislature passes a law that says if you want to do a certain activity, you have to get a license for that activity from DFS, a financial services activity. And so any of these licensed activities, pawnbroker, again, money transmitter, lender, et cetera, someone could engage in that action, operate a pawn shop, send money, service a loan without having gotten the requisite license. And that is where this sort of gap in authority for DFS fell, is that they have authority over the licensees, but through some quirk in the original drafting of the law, didn't have authority for folks who did the activity without getting the license first.
Well, is there a reason to believe that someone might be operating in New York without the appropriate license or registration for non-nefarious reasons? Is there any reason to give somebody the benefit of the doubt if they're in this space and not licensed?
For the most part, I think folks who enter an industry with good faith and just want to operate a business want to follow the rules, right? There's maybe a subpopulation of folks who don't know the rules or didn't do the research first, and that's a little concerning if you're going to get into an industry like financial services where there's real money at stake for a consumer who gets, poor services or something like that. So I think for the most part, we can think of this as nefarious bad actors who aren't getting a license because they want to avoid or evade the regulation and scrutiny that comes with a license. When you're licensed by the state, they have access to all your books. You have to sort of answer the phone when they call. You've got to be accountable to them. So having a license is really about accountability. Now, there could be, and I don't want to make presumptions of bad faith here, but there could be some sectors, fintech, for example, who really market themselves as being novel and new and alternatives to existing financial products, who might take the stance very publicly that they don't need to get a license because they're not actually engaging in that licensed activity. And ultimately, that would come down to sort of investigation, fact finding, and determination by the state or ultimately by a court to say, okay, is this, potentially new product or quote unquote cutting edge fintech product actually just an online or electronic version of something that we require a license for, in which case it would need a license, or is it actually new, in which case the state has not required a license for it. So that's one instance where the goal might not be to avoid licensure per se, but someone may be wrong in asserting that they don't need a license for what they're doing.
Well, sticking with that idea of the potential for gray area, in the decade and a half now of the Department of Financial Services, is there any sort of track record that they have built up, or maybe when you think about the new leadership under Governor Kathy Hochul, that indicates how they go about policing something like that? Do you think that they look into the gray area and say, no, this is clearly XYZ, regardless of how you frame it? Or does it seem like this is a department that will generally defer to the operators when they say, yep, this is what we're doing here, and this is why it doesn't fall under your regulations?
Right. So DFS is probably considered one of the stronger, more important financial regulators in the country, not just among the states, but including federal regulators. That's in large part because it oversees a lot of Wall Street businesses. That being said, I think there are some more aggressive regulators who see something and sort of jump on it immediately and make a determination before a whole cottage industry can take root. It's much harder after 5 or 10 years of an industry or a sector operating without certain scrutiny to then come in and say, oh, you were all doing this wrong. We're going to take you off the market. We're going to pull you out from consumers who are using you. And no one really wants to be in that position. The goal of these regulators is really not to crack down on actors who are maybe breaking the rules. In my experience, and I think this is generally a good approach, if, for example, this is hypothetical, if DFS were to come across an entity engaging in licensed activity without a license, which is to say they should have come to DFS first, more likely than not, they would just say, hey, you need to come get a license from us, right? The goal here is not to sue them, take them to court, and impose millions of dollars of penalties. The goal is get them into the regulatory fold and make sure that DFS can keep an eye on them. And so I think, DFS can be more aggressive in some instances, but that doesn't mean it has to be an aggressive sort of impose fines, ask questions later sort of attitude.
Well, sticking with that enforcement idea, then, how do you think the Department of Financial Services should use their expanded authority in these cases where they now can impose monetary penalties on players who have been operating without a license or a registration? Is this something where they should come down immediately with penalties, or is there a case to be made for education first and foremost?
Yeah, in terms of bad actors, ones who are just clearly, more in that fly by night camp and are just trying to avoid the cost and burden of having a license, because, with a license, which gives you the privilege of doing a certain business in the state, comes responsibility, right? You have to submit reports, you've got to pay an annual fee, you've got to, again, answer the phone if DFS calls. So anyone who is really actively trying to avoid that for activity that is very clearly covered by the license, I think it makes sense to impose penalties and just throw the book at them and get them licensed or get them shut down. Those are the options. With that sort of fintech gray area, I think it's a tool they can use to make a decision and take a stand, right? They can, instead of just saying, hey, we think you need to get licensed, if after some hopefully productive conversations, it looks like they're at an impasse and the state thinks they need to get a license and the company maintains that it's not engaged in activity that requires a license, this now gives the agency a tool to say, well, we think you do need a license and we're going to impose these penalties. Now, that's almost inevitably going to wind up in court, but it has a forcing mechanism to say, all right, let's figure this out, as opposed to sort of being stuck in a standoff of saying, hey, please come get a license without any teeth behind that.
Well, this legislative response is in response to basically a patchwork system of licenses and registrations that have popped up over the years in the financial services law and the banking law, and as opposed to taking that sort of patchwork response and adjusting each individual law, this seems to be taking a more broader look that also is maybe proactive in the future, in the sense that now you can write other new licenses and not have to address this issue. Does this make sense to you, by essentially just creating the ability to penalize someone for a prohibited, unlicensed act? Is this the right legislative response, or should we be going back into the books and updating each individual underlying statute of these licenses and registrations?
I think this approach is totally appropriate. It doesn't really make a difference in terms of the outcome, but I think having a catch-all that makes it very clear what the intent of any individual section of law would be, which is to say that the legislature intended for DFS to be able to regulate this industry. It wasn't intended to be so dependent on the actual licensure of an individual actor. I think having this spelled out clearly going forward as a drafting, bill writing exercise and mechanism, they should be clear going forward. But I think this is a totally fine reset and sort of cleanup strategy. And then again, as they pass things going forward, the sort of what's considered best practices in financial regulation and consumer protection evolves over time, and they should always be incorporating new thoughts into their drafting. But I think this is an effective and appropriate way to address the existing laws.
Well, we've been speaking with Winston Berkman-Breen. He's the legal director for Protect Borrowers and previously worked at the State Department of Financial Services. Winston, thank you so much for lending us your time and expertise. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.